And the PSA Parliaments train keeps on rolling. We've got Margaret Arnott lined up, who's going to speak next. Margaret's going to tell us a little bit about some of her work looking at interparliamentary relations in the devolved UK. Margaret, how are you feeling? Are you ready to go?
Yeah, ready to go. Thank you very much, Gavin. And thanks also for inviting me to present from our research on interparliamentary relations. I enjoyed the previous presentations, and excellent presentations, and they sort of tie in very well to some of the issues that I'm going to flag up. In terms of interparliamentary relations in the devolved UK, and consider the current workings of interparliamentary relations and the challenges that might actually be taking it forward in terms of how we might move forward in terms of the future working of devolution and constitutional relations in the multinational UK. It draws on my research as a PSA Commons academic fellow on modernisation and devolution, and also work with the Independent Welsh Institute on basically the kind of interparliamentary relations funded by the Legal Education Foundation. And as we kind of saw in previous presentation, the devolution settlements in the UK are far from settled, been subject to kind of changes and a gradual increase in powers over the devolved legislators, although it's not been uniform in terms of the extent of powers that's been devolved. And there's issues about fragmentation and coordination in terms of the working of devolution and interparliamentary relations. And as Kathleen Gormley-Heaney and Mark Sanford argued, basically the divergent constitutional narratives underpinning relations in the UK are very much to the fore, especially after the kind of 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 referendum as well. So whatever constitutional future you see for the UK in terms of reforming devolution, quasi-federal state, or self-determination in terms of the different nations of the UK, the place for intergovernmental relations and interparliamentary relations should be considered in terms of their scrutiny, accountability, and basically their legitimation in terms of some of the decision making that's going on in terms of the working of devolution. Today, what I'm going to do is briefly divide my kind of talk in terms of kind of three parts. And through each of the parts, the principles and practices of interparliamentary relations are examined. Alongside the structures, the culture matters. And I'm going to say a bit very briefly about existing interparliamentary relations, and that ties into work done by other kind of colleagues, and obviously kind of something Jack as well in terms of your work in interparliamentary relations, and also Adam as well. And after that, I'm going to think about the political and the constitutional drivers that might shape debates about future interparliamentary reforms. Okay, so what I'm arguing is, regardless of what you see in terms of where we might end up in the constitutional future, in terms of reforming the Union, debates about kind of unification of Ireland or self-determination of territories, interparliamentary relations is going to have to be one of the areas considered, okay? And then I'm going to finish up with some conclusions in terms of what it means for the principles and practices of interparliamentary relations in the future. Okay, so very briefly, the first kind of point relates to what we've got at the moment. And there's some excellent work out there in terms of, I suppose, the kind of informal nature of interparliamentary relations in the devolved UK. And that ties into debates about what functions do legislators perform. And there was some excellent panels earlier in terms of looking at the functions of legislators that tie into some of the debates that I want to kind of link to interparliamentary relations directly. So when you think about why legislators matter, the important work by a number of academics, and recently the article by David Judge and Christine Lesson-Vieira in terms of why legislators matter, kind of emphasises the importance of legitimation. Okay, so legitimation and legitimation processes is going to be key to understanding legislators as political institutions. Okay, so as political institutions, they reflect different political systems. And as Jack set out kind of very well in his talk before me, basically there are divergent kind of stories to be told now about how the political institutions of legislators tie into different electoral divergence across the UK. And through that kind of lens of legitimation and public deliberation, we see different kind of roles for legislators. And we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, we think about the implications for legislators that were discussed in earlier seminars as well. All of this ties into the important issue of territorial representation and how legislators have adapted as well in terms of the COVID pandemic and the different responses by the devolved governments, parliaments, and the relationships between those actors in terms of openness and basically awareness of what's going on in the different kind of devolved frameworks across the UK. So in terms of existing interparliamentary relations, the only formal mechanism really is the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly. And again, there's some good work out there kind of doing critiques about the extent to which it uses non-legislative kind of roles to follow through some kind of workings between legislators in the devolved UK and other kind of Crown territories as well. There's occasional kind of meetings by presiding officers and speakers of the 4 legislators in the UK. There's informal links with officials and also cross-workings of some committees informally. And we've also seen the weaknesses in interparliamentary relations in terms of holding intergovernmental decisions to account in a number of committees and devolved legislators, and also in the House of Commons and Lords as well. Obviously the PACAC report in 2016, there was a 2015 report by the Scottish Parliament Devolution Further Powers Committee. And in 2015, there was a written agreement provided by the Scottish Government that it would consult in terms of the workings of parliamentary relations with committees in the Scottish Parliament. Okay. So the liaison role is important, but the structures that exist are informal and patchy. And the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit, which was established in October 2017, came out of a report recommended from the House of Lords on the establishment of a kind of forum in terms of the working through of Brexit and devolution. Because obviously the Joint Ministerial Committee had not met to kind of basically kind of establish how they're going to basically approach Brexit and devolution. So for the House of Lords, Senate, Scottish Parliament, they had regular attendees to the Brexit Forum, but the House of Commons, it was more intermittent in terms of representation there. So perhaps there's a cultural issue. And obviously there's the current kind of inquiry by the Procedures Committee on territorial constitution, and there's been some kind of not just to do with evil English votes for English laws, but also in terms of how we think about moving forward to develop interparliamentary forums more so. So I want to move on to my second kind of area briefly. And this, I suppose, is the key one in terms of where we are now in terms of the constitutional and political drivers for reform. I would say we're now in a very different place because of Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic, and they've accentuated the constitutional pressures facing the UK. So regardless of what your answer is in terms of reforming the UK, you're going to have to think about the patterns of relationships between the territories of the UK and how they're going to actually kind of work together in terms of pooled sovereignty and also in terms of shared interests. So devolution was about legitimacy deficits back in 1999. Now we're back there, but we're back there in a different context. We're in Brexit, we're concerning the COVID pandemic. So what we want to do is think about the cross-policy working that is required regardless of what the constitutional state of the UK is. Devolved UK operated within, until the start of last year, the kind of EU regulations, and as a result of that, there was perhaps less need for shared working across Devolved UK. But as we move to new common frameworks, particularly as we saw with the EU withdrawal bills and also the internal market bills, that basically legitimacy and sovereignty is key in terms of understanding the input and the functions of legislators. And obviously the Miller cases as well, and the decisions in 2017 to do with the informal workings of the mechanisms for devolution, sort of chimes into debates now about a revisiting of the legislative consent motion and a review of what kind of sovereignty and legitimacy actually means in devolution. Those are big constitutional questions, but they really kind of have severe implications for day-to-day workings of devolution as well. So while we think about the principle of sovereignty of the UK, we think, well, what does that actually mean as we move forward to another kind of constitutional debate? Thanks. Outside the EU. So the governance of the UK, there's very different discourses about where we might be going next. And obviously there's various opinion poll evidence in Scotland about kind of independence, in Ireland about remaining in the UK or United Ireland, and whether to hold a referendum for a United Ireland within 5 years. And in Wales, there seems to be more debates about kind of independence as well. So there's divergence there. But how does divergence actually tie into some of the debates about reforming the union? And as Gordon Brown argued earlier this month, about a failed state being a risk if you don't reform in terms of relationships between the devolved territories. I would finish up by saying that you need broad public consent to provide via Parliament's support for constitutional change. And in the context of an informal workings of devolution, you're not going to be able to square the circle there without entering into debates about pooled sovereignty, about basically the accountability gap and democratic scrutiny as well. Okay? So sudden change to the Constitution following Brexit and following the COVID-19 pandemic responses, major decisions now lie in terms of the workings across the UK, regardless of where we're going on constitutional reform, about how we work together in terms of pooled resources. Okay, and I'll finish there just now. Thanks, Gavin.